Before we begin tonight's episode, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the nature of the conversation you're about to hear. This episode centers around the reported passing of a cultural icon, someone whose presence extended far beyond film and television and into the way many people understood strength, discipline, and identity itself. When figures like this leave, it doesn't just spark conversation, it stirs emotion, memory, and in some cases, a sense of loss that goes deeper than expected. As always, what you'll hear on this show are perspectives, not absolutes. We approach these topics from different angles with different experiences, and sometimes with strong opinions that may not reflect your own. That's intentional. The goal here isn't to tell you what to think. It's to challenge how you think and maybe even why you think it. Tonight's discussion may touch on themes of masculinity, cultural change, legacy, and generational identity, topics that can be personal and, at times, polarizing. Listener discretion is advised, not because the conversation is dangerous, but because it might make you pause, reflect, and question things you haven't thought about in a while.
You ever notice how certain people don't feel like they can die? Not because they're immortal, but because they've become something bigger than a person. They become a symbol, a standard, a piece of the culture itself. Chuck Norris wasn't just an actor. He wasn't just a martial artist. He wasn't just a tough guy on TV. He was the embodiment of a kind of strength that doesn't really exist in today's world anymore. Quiet, controlled, disciplined, and dangerous without needing to prove it. And now we're sitting here in a world where that presence is gone, and it feels different. Not just sad, but hollow in a way that's hard to explain. Because when someone like Chuck Norris passes, it's not just a man leaving. It's a signal that an entire era is officially behind us. The era where men were measured by what they could endure, not what they could post. Where respect wasn't demanded, it was earned. Where strength didn't need a hashtag and masculinity didn't need to apologize for existing. But here's the real question. What replaces that? Because culture doesn't stay empty for long. When a figure like that disappears, something fills the vacuum. And if we're being honest, what's filling it right now doesn't look anything like what we lost. It looks softer, louder, more performative, and a whole lot less grounded in reality. So tonight isn't just about remembering Chuck Norris, it's about asking what happens next. Because if the legends are gone, then what exactly are we being left with? All right, let's bring in the crew tonight, because this one's going to hit different. Brian's here, and I already know he's about to go full MAGA fire meets action movie nostalgia on this one. Rachel's here, bringing perspective, balance, and probably reminding us this conversation is bigger than just one man. Daniel's in the shadows like always, connecting dots that may or may not make you question everything you thought you knew. And Skylar's here, ready to challenge all of it from a completely different angle, especially when it comes to identity, culture, and what strength even means today. And me? I'm just trying to figure out how we went from Walker, Texas Ranger, to whatever the hell we've got now. All right, let's slow this down for a second before we jump into reactions, because I think this is one of those moments that deserves more than just a headline and a quick take. When news breaks that someone like Chuck Norris has passed, the immediate response is what you'd expect. People sharing clips, quotes, memories, jokes, all the things that come with losing someone who's been part of the culture for decades. But underneath all of that, there's something else happening. There's this quiet realization that we're not just losing a person, we're losing a piece of a world that doesn't really exist anymore. And I think that's what makes this hit different. Because Chuck Norris wasn't just entertainment. He represented something. A version of strength that didn't need attention. A version of masculinity that didn't need explanation. A presence that felt grounded, controlled, and earned over time. Not built overnight, not performed for clicks. Not shaped by whatever trend was hot that week. So the question I want to start with tonight isn't just about him. It's about what he stood for. When someone like Chuck Norris passes, are we just losing an actor? Or are we losing something much bigger in our culture? Something that maybe we don't even fully understand until it's gone. And I want you to really think about that before you answer. Brian, start us off.
Artie, we didn't just lose an actor. We lost a symbol of what men used to be before everything got watered down and turned into some kind of social experiment. Chuck Norris didn't need to scream, didn't need to posture. didn't need to go online and tell you how tough he was. You just knew. The guy walked into a room and you could feel it. And that's because his strength came from discipline, from training, from a life built on something real instead of validation from strangers on the internet. And what bothers me is not just that he's gone, it's that we don't have anyone stepping up to replace that kind of presence. Instead, what we're getting is this version of masculinity that's either completely neutered or completely fake, guys acting tough for clicks, or guys being told that being strong is somehow a problem. Chuck Norris represented control, honor, and accountability. And those are the exact things culture seems to be moving away from right now. So yeah, this isn't just about losing a man. This is about losing a standard. And the scary part is, I don't know if we're ever getting that standard back.
Artie. Yeah. And Brian, what you just said, that idea of losing a standard. That's the part that sticks with me, because it's not something you can measure, but you can feel it. It's like there was a time where certain traits just meant something without needing to be debated, and now everything feels like it's up for interpretation, negotiation, or approval. And I'll be honest, part of me struggles with that shift, because I don't know if what we've replaced it with is actually stronger, or if it's just louder. But Rachel, let me bring you in here because I know you're going to look at this with a little more balance. Are we actually losing something real here? Or are we just looking back through nostalgia and making it bigger than it really was?
I think it's both, Artie, and that's where this conversation gets important. There's absolutely a tendency to look back and elevate figures like Chuck Norris into something almost mythological. And part of that is nostalgia. Part of that is the storytelling we've built around him. And part of that is the era he came from. But that doesn't mean the impact wasn't real. And it doesn't mean the values he represented didn't resonate deeply with people. What's changed isn't just the type of figures we have, it's the environment those figures exist in. Today's culture rewards visibility, speed, and constant engagement, while figures like Chuck Norris came from a time where presence, consistency, and discipline were enough. That shift changes what we value, and it changes who rises to the top. So it's not necessarily that strength, discipline, and resilience are gone, it's that they're no longer the primary traits being elevated. And I think the real question isn't whether we've lost something, because in many ways we have. It's whether we're willing to recognize what was valuable about it and adapt those qualities into a modern context instead of just mourning them as something that only existed in the past.
That's a solid way to frame it, because it's not just about what we had, it's about what gets rewarded now. And those are two very different things. And I think that's where a lot of people feel that disconnect, because even if those traits still exist, they're not the ones being put front and center anymore. They're not the ones being celebrated, amplified, or pushed into the spotlight. And I'll say this, when the spotlight changes, the culture follows, whether we like it or not. But Daniel, I know you don't think this is accidental, and I can already see where you're going with this. So let me ask you straight. When we see this kind of shift, when one type of figure fades out and another takes its place, is that just evolution? Or is there something more intentional behind it?
Of course I am, because when figures like Chuck Norris become larger than life, you have to ask why those particular archetypes were elevated in the first place. Chuck Norris wasn't just a random success story, he was part of a broader cultural narrative during a time when strength, order, and control were being heavily emphasized both domestically and globally. These figures served as symbols of stability in an uncertain world, and that's not accidental. What we're seeing now is not just the loss of an individual, but the replacement of one set of archetypes with another. The strong, silent, disciplined warrior archetype is being phased out and replaced with more expressive, more fragmented, and in some cases, more controlled forms of identity. That shift aligns with broader changes in media, technology, and social influence structures, where attention is currency and identity is constantly being reshaped. So, the question isn't just what we lost, it's who benefits from what replaces it. Because culture doesn't evolve randomly, It's guided, incentivized, and in many cases, engineered.
All right, so now we've gone from losing a legend to questioning whether the entire system behind who becomes a legend has changed, or maybe was always controlled in ways we didn't fully see. And I'll admit, part of me hears that and thinks, yeah, there's probably some truth to how culture gets shaped and pushed in certain directions. But at the same time, not everything can just be boiled down to manipulation either. Sometimes things really do change because people change. So, Skylar, let me bring you in here because you tend to challenge this from a completely different angle. When we talk about someone like Chuck Norris representing strength, discipline, and that old school presence, are we actually losing those qualities or are we just redefining what strength looks like in today's world?
I actually think there's value in stepping back from the idea that strength only looks one way. Because while Chuck Norris absolutely represented discipline and resilience, those traits don't disappear just because the cultural packaging changes. What we're seeing now is a broader definition of strength that includes emotional awareness, adaptability, and different forms of resilience that weren't always recognized in the past. That doesn't mean the old model didn't have value, but it also doesn't mean it was the only version of strength that existed. There were always people who didn't fit that mold, and today's culture is making more space for those perspectives. So instead of framing this as a loss, it could also be seen as an expansion, an evolution of what strength looks like in a more complex and interconnected world. And I think honoring someone like Chuck Norris doesn't require us to say that everything today is worse. It can also mean recognizing that the qualities he represented can coexist with new ones, rather than being replaced entirely.
Yeah. And Skylar, I think that's where this conversation really lands, somewhere right in the middle of all of it. Because on one hand, I can see what you're saying. The idea that strength doesn't have to look exactly the way it used to, that it can evolve, expand, and show up in different ways depending on the world we're living in. And there's truth in that. There has to be, because the world itself isn't the same as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. But at the same time, when I can't shake the feeling that something did get lost along the way, not everything, but something. That quiet, grounded, no-nonsense presence that didn't need validation, didn't need constant visibility, didn't need to explain itself to be respected. And maybe that's the part people are reacting to when they hear a name like Chuck Norris and realize he's gone. So maybe this isn't just about losing a man. And maybe it's not just about redefining strength either. Maybe it's about trying to figure out how to carry forward the parts that mattered without losing them completely in the process. And whether we're doing that or drifting further away from it, I think that's something we're still trying to answer.
All right, before we keep going, let's take a second. Because if we're talking about legends, discipline, and that old school edge, this is the perfect moment to talk about something built with that same mindset. Over at the Data and Dissonance store, we're not just throwing logos on products. This merch is designed to represent exactly what we've been talking about tonight. Strength, resilience, independence, and yeah, a little bit of that don't mess with me energy that guys like Chuck Norris made iconic without ever having to say a word. You've got the hoodies, the hats, the shirts, the mugs, all built around one idea. Speak truth, stir thought, not follow trends, not chase approval. Just stand on what you believe and let that speak for itself. And if you really want to lean into that energy, the coffee line is where it hits different. High Lakes, light roast, smooth, sharp, gets you moving. Rock Creek, medium roast, balanced, steady, built for the long haul. Bitter root, dark roast, strong, bold, no nonsense, and probably the closest thing we've got to what I imagine Chuck Norris drinks before sunrise. Because let's be honest, some people wake up and check their phone. Others wake up and take control of their day. And this merch, it's for the second group. So if you want to support the show, represent the message, and maybe bring a little more of that old school edge back into your daily routine, head over to the Data and Dissonance store. Gear up, grab a bag of coffee, and carry it like you mean it.
You know, it's a strange thing when someone like Chuck Norris leaves this world because it forces you to confront something most people don't like to think about. Not just mortality, but legacy. Not just the end of a life, but the question of what actually remains after it. And when you look at a man like that, you realize his impact wasn't just in the roles he played or the image he carried. It was in what he represented to millions of people who never met him but still understood exactly what he stood for. And I keep coming back to this idea tonight, that maybe what we're really reacting to isn't just his passing, but what it represents. Because whether people want to admit it or not, there was something about that era, about those kinds of men, that felt grounded. It felt steady. It felt like there were lines that didn't need to be explained, values that didn't need to be debated, and a level of discipline that wasn't negotiable. And now, we're living in a time where everything feels a little more fluid, a little more uncertain, and a lot more performative. And I'm not sitting here saying everything today is worse, because it's not that simple. There are things we've gained, perspectives we've opened up, conversations we're having now that probably needed to happen. But at the same time, I don't think it's wrong to acknowledge that something meaningful got left behind along the way. Something quiet, something strong, something that didn't need attention to exist, but commanded respect anyway. So maybe the real takeaway tonight isn't about looking back and wishing things were the way they used to be. And it's not about blindly accepting whatever comes next either. Maybe it's about responsibility. Because if the people we grew up looking up to are gone, if the figures who set the standard are no longer here, then that leaves a gap. And that gap doesn't just fill itself with something better by default. It gets filled by whatever we allow to take its place. And that means the question isn't just what we lost. It's what we're choosing to carry forward. Discipline, integrity, strength, accountability. Not the loud version, not the performative version, the real version. The kind that doesn't need recognition to matter. So tonight, we acknowledge the loss. We respect the legacy. We recognize what that name meant and still means. But more importantly, we ask ourselves a harder question. What kind of standard are we setting now for the people who are watching us? Because one day, whether we like it or not, that's going to be the legacy we leave behind. Remember to speak truth. Stir thought.
Tonight's episode is brought to you by the creative world behind Data and Dissonance, where storytelling doesn't just entertain, it challenges, it questions, and it sticks with you long after the final word. If you're drawn to the kind of themes we talked about tonight, legacy, discipline, moral lines, and the weight of decisions, then you need to check out the Caleb Rourke thriller series. It starts with the Covenant Protocol, a story that pulls you into a world where truth is buried beneath layers of control, deception, and power. It continues with the Prophet Directive, raising the stakes and pushing the line between right and wrong even further, and now Black Echo Rising is out, expanding that universe into something even darker, more intense, and more revealing than ever before. These aren't just action thrillers. They're stories about what happens when good people are forced to make impossible choices in a world that doesn't play fair. And that same energy carries over into the music. If you're looking for something real and something with grit, emotion, and meaning behind it, check out the album Uncaged. It's raw, it's heavy, and it's rooted in real-life struggles. Addiction, war, pain, and the fight to keep moving forward when everything in you wants to stop. It's got that 90s grunge feel. Think along the lines of old-school rock where the message matters just as much as the sound. And on the other side of that, you've got Four Wheelers and Hallelujah. That album leans into country storytelling, faith, family, freedom, and the everyday people holding this country together. Songs like Stand Tall Charlie capture that spirit of resilience and pride that ties directly into everything we talk about here on the show. So whether you're diving into the books or turning up the music, you're stepping into the same world that fuels these conversations. You can find everything, books, music, merch, and more through the Data and Dissonance links in the description. Support the mission, support the message, and be part of something that actually stands for something.